Welcome to the MS Dev Show, episode number 184. This week we talk with Dan Roth and Steve Sanderson about Blazor, a way to run .NET in the browser using WebAssembly. GitHub was hit with the biggest DDoS ever recorded. And Bill Gates weighs in on the tabs versus spaces debate.
Raygun gives you complete visibility on errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. Replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files or having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window into how users are really experiencing your software applications. Check it out today at raygun.com.
This week we have Daniel Roth, program manager on the ASP.NET team, and we have Steve Sanderson, a developer on the ASP.NET team. How's it going, guys?
It's going great.
Great. Good to be here.
Yeah, I was talking to some people at the MVP Summit the other week, and they had just come out of your session, and they were like freaking out. They were so excited, and I'm like, we're gonna have that on the MS Dev Show. So they were, yeah. So it's super awesome stuff. So we'll get to that very shortly. But first, we got the comment of the week. What is the comment of the week, Carl?
This week, we grabbed the comment of the week off of iTunes.
You just want to summarize it, Carl? I know it's pretty long.
Yes, it's by Arvix. It says, awesome, period. So there it is, verbatim.
I didn't want you to read the whole thing.
If you want to get mentioned on the show like Arvix, send us an email to feedback@msdevshow.com. Comment on Facebook, YouTube, or Stitcher. And we really like these 5-star iTunes reviews as well. They really help get the podcast up there and noticed by people.
Yeah, and people have been really great with that. I've been seeing lots of those pour in, so thank you so much. Okay, so let's jump into the news because we got a couple pretty cool stories. So the first one is an annual tradition for us, which is going through the Stack Overflow developer survey results for 2018. And I don't know if there was anything in particular that you wanted to call out here, Carl.
So, we've done like a bunch of these topics, from these reviews in the past. And I wanted to just pull like two different things out of there than what we normally do. The first one is one that I think pretty much everybody on Twitter definitely noticed is the diversity on Stack Overflow is nowhere even close to where the industry's at.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Much less where, it should be. So diversity, at least on people who take the survey at Stack Overflow is I think it was under 10% female. So, obviously
is there any guesses as to why? I mean, because it's just like, if you do a survey of people who like to take surveys, it's like 100%, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, is it something as silly as, they don't want to take the survey or, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm not exactly certain, but I did just recently listen to the Stack Overflow podcast with John Skeeton, and he is a very big advocate for diversity, and he had talked up several issues that Stack Overflow in general has with diversity. Not that he's had any solutions, but it's definitely something that they are not reflecting even what the developer population is.
Yeah. And they're not controlling too, like what Google is showing and Bing and is actually showing results, who is showing the results to, right? I would expect there to be like equal representation there. So I wonder if it's mostly around the survey where there's a bigger difference. So I was hoping we had answers, but it sounds like we don't.
No, we have more questions. But The other one that I think is really interesting that I pulled out of here is, in the last year, we've heard a ton from Microsoft and Google and basically every big tech company about AI and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all that fun stuff. And sometimes you wonder, is this just the next buzzword? Is it the next, IoT blockchain kind of thing? And what the interesting thing is, both Python and R moved way up on the charts on Stack Overflow questions. So that really seems to confirm that, people, aren't just curious about it. They're kind of digging into it and playing with it in meaningful ways.
Yeah, Python was the fastest growing language, which is pretty wild. And
especially considering that it's not a new language. Normally that's reserved for the new languages.
Yeah, it's pretty ancient actually. And then JavaScript is just like king on Stack Overflow by such a huge margin because it's JavaScript. And then it's funny because they're not even really like programming languages, but it goes JavaScript, then it's HTML, CSS, what you'd expect, SQL, which is actually a little surprising considering JavaScript is the first one. Like I would expect SQL to be high, but then I would expect C# to be high as well. And since C# is low, I would sort of expect SQL to be lower, although it just does say SQL. And then there's Java, and then there's Bash, which is kind of interesting, and then Python, and then C#, which is interesting to me. So yeah, JavaScript is still king from a Stack Overflow perspective. There were some other things that, you know what? Under databases, MySQL and SQL Server are pretty darn close, and they're both at the top of the list. So it could be MySQL with SQL.
I think there's a sort of a smoothing effect that occurs also because there's so much more choice now with all the languages.
Yeah.
The percentages all sort of kind of drop.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a long tail. I mean, as far as databases, like I didn't know this many databases existed, which is actually pretty crazy because if I look at like the lowest one on here at 1.7%, it's Apache HBase, which I know of. Like it's not like some unknown thing. And then there's like Google BigQuery. This is like reading from the bottom up. Apache Hive, Amazon Redshift. It's pretty wild, but coming down from the top, yeah, MySQL, SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, yeah, with actually pretty impressive. In fact, okay, I'm really confused now because this adds up to be way more than 100%.
Multiple selections.
People can choose more than one database.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess. I mean, but like this is like 400%. So, I mean, if everybody using 4, I don't know. That's really strange. Platforms, again, their numbers are so skewed. I wish we had like a better representation, but Linux is 48%. I'm guessing that's because of a lot of server side stuff. And then number 2 is Windows. And then Android shows up too. So does Android also count as Linux? I don't know. Anything else you wanted to call out here, Carl?
Those were the top 2 things that I wanted to look at. And of course we'll have the link to it in our show notes. So, click on the link.
Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to call it was the experience. Here we go. Over half of respondents have 5 years of professional coding experience or less. And this is something we've talked about where, every time we think that we have to, like at conferences or on the podcast, we have to talk about these like super advanced techie things. And then we find out it's not the case because the reality is like half of our industry is, almost brand new and they're just trying to learn some of the basics. We can never forget that because it's growing so fast. So I did just want to call it to that. Okay. So let's move on. GitHub was hit with the largest DDoS ever recorded.
Yeesh.
Yeah. So, at the end of February, GitHub had a recorded DDoS attack at 1.35 terabytes per second. So that's a lot of data. And with the amplification attacks that there are, it doesn't take much to do that nowadays.
Oh, nice. Their page has autoplay.
Yes.
I'm going to close that. So anyway, I'm going to have to do this from memory then. But one interesting thing in the article, so it was talking about, it was Memcache. It was, you can, apparently they have like a mechanism by which you can make the request and then it will actually basically do like a webhook type of thing, or it'll call back to yourself. And basically what they do is they were spoofing the source IP to be GitHub's, and then they would put something huge in the cache, and then they would say, "Hey, can you just give me that item real quick?" And then it would go to GitHub, and it was a 10,000x multiplication factor. So basically, with that kind of amplification factor, I mean, you could use one computer.
Actually, it's saying 51,000x amplification.
Oh, 51,000x. Yeah. So, I mean, even with like one computer, you could DDoS somebody at this scale, which is scary.
Why would someone do that? Who are these people?
Who hates GitHub?
Why are they so mean?
Yeah, especially to GitHub. Like,
hate their community. I don't
know. Is that the guys from? Is it the guys from GitLab or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bitbucket or something. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So, and then self-driving Uber car kills Arizona pedestrian. So this actually just happened, or this came out this story came out a couple hours ago. And, I feel obviously bad for the person who was hit here. And, I don't know. This is just more, I am very, I don't know how you would say it. I am pessimistic in regards to self-driving cars, more so than most people in the industry. And I know this is just one. This is like, this is obviously, this might even still, the self-driving cars might still be better than humans. Like people were trying to figure out statistics, but you can't really do a comparison at this point because of the lack of data. But I don't think we're ready, especially for like 3 different companies who really aren't working together to start writing software that we know has bugs. I mean, they can't get the most basic software running, and now they think that all this other stuff. I don't know. I'm so pessimistic on this. I'm sorry.
I have exactly the opposite perspective.
And I figured most people do. I am just,
you're an outlier on the car thing, Jason.
Yeah.
Well, like just consider for a second, like all those people that you probably know, some of them who you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that person is behind the wheel of a car. Like, or maybe you've driven with some people,
I agree.
You're like, oh, this person's trying to kill me in this car. Like, wouldn't it be nicer if there was a piece of software you could trust that would just drive you safely?
Well, to be clear, I think
super fast.
I believe that we'll get there. So just to kind of drill down on what I'm pessimistic on, it's the short-term viability of this. I don't think they have it figured out. I mean, it's just like, they've tested 1 million miles. They haven't tested those in the edge cases. I mean, they pick like all of the best scenarios to actually do this in. In fact, if you look at what happened in this case, the car, it looks like it says pedestrian, but it sounds like, and the facts are not, well, I'm sure we'll hear more in the coming days, but what it looks like is it actually hit somebody that was on a bike. And if you look, if you go look at Google Maps and actually look at the intersection, I had to look at it for a while. I'm sitting there like looking around. It's confusing as hell, and I'm a human, like, and I understand, like, ultimately the computer will be able to figure out quicker than I will. Guess what? It can't today, right? Like it sees that and it's just like, what is going on? Because it's basically, there's a car lane and then the right turn lane has to pass over the bike lane. And sure, I mean, the car should have all these sensors and it shouldn't hit, somebody who's on a bike or whatever. Like that seems kind of silly. And again, it will get there. Like they will be 1,000 times better drivers than humans. But right now, I mean, the fact that you can write X amount of software, I don't know how many lines of code it is, right? Or, they write the software and then they're just like, oh, ship it and we'll test it in production with people's lives. Like that whole thing just seems crazy to me. And I don't know. I'm just thinking, like if you've ever just do this mental exercise. Now, over the next couple of weeks, when you were driving and you see, just look for like edge case scenarios, when somebody does something crazy, or you just see like an intersection where you get to it and you're like, what am I supposed to do? I mean, there are literally intersections where it is not clear, period. You could have a committee of 100 people and you have this intersection and based on the signs that are there, it is not clear what you were supposed to do. And what do we do? You kind of come up and you're like, it sort of looks safe, right? And there is a way to solve that and the computers will do that. But like, what does the computer do today? I mean, have they really, do you think they've really written the code to like make that decision in that case where even right now we can't understand it?
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing that, I want to look at with this, article is the reactionary, responses of the industry and of the lawmakers.
Yeah.
Because,
that's gonna be the problem.
Because, at least in the United States, we do respond to incidents like these in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're not exactly what you'd expect. So I'm going to find it interesting to see exactly what the outcome of this lady's death will have on the future of this technology. But, you were talking about all the edge cases, sometimes there's just, obvious scenarios that, when you have computers run across them, if you have a 4-way stop and you have 4 cars get there at precisely the same time, nobody and everybody has the right of way. So obviously humans, somebody's going to be a little bit more aggressive and somebody's just going to take the right of way. But, are you going to have like some sort of short range networking where the computers can,
Actually, there's a whole bunch of interesting aspects to that. Because first of all, if all cars go at the same time, they actually won't hit each other. That's the interesting thing about a four-way stop, by the way.
And that might be the way it's solved.
Yeah. I mean, eventually, yes, that will be the perfect. Actually, none of them will stop. I mean, why would you even have a four-way stop? It doesn't make any sense. You just adjust the timing. So I know that's the world that we're trying to get to. But I don't know. Let's say. Here, let me give you an example. Right by my house, there's a road that goes to the grocery store. Somebody hit the sign, and the sign is laying beside the road. Now, I've been there before. I know that I have to stop there. A self-driving car, like, is it going to remember that used to be a stop? And then it also is going to be like, hey, the other day I saw the stop sign laying on the ground, and now it's gone. But I know that I should still stop here because this intersection is bad up here, and maybe there'll be like super radar where it can see like, okay, here's the speed of this vehicle and keep me safe. They just don't have that today. Like, you can't tell me, like, would you guys, Dan, do you have kids?
I do have kids.
Okay. Would you put your kids in there by themselves and take them to that intersection I'm talking about where the stop sign was hit by a car, it's gone, and tell the car like, yep, go ahead. Would you do that today?
Today this self-driving tech is pretty early. I will give you that. I think you're just saying that it's
that's
early
all.
right
That's
now.
all I'm saying. Honestly, that's all I'm saying.
But I believe that if it's not already now, very soon that car will get to that intersection, and even though there's not a stop sign there, it'll be able to react to any situation in that intersection so much faster than a human driver could do that you will prefer 10 times out of 10 to have the car driving the car driving itself than you driving the car.
So I think about 2 years ago I said we were about a decade out. So I think we're about 8 years out is my current prediction. So were you going to say something, Steve?
Yeah, I wonder if there's going to be a little phase when, say, 2/3 of the cars on the road are self-driving and 1/3 are not. And then the people who are driving their own cars manually will have a huge advantage because they can just drive straight through stop signs or anything else, and they know that all the other cars are going to stop for them.
And that's already the case, actually. So that's already been happening. So in areas where they're testing the self-driving car, if you see one, pedestrians are actually just ignoring them and walking out in front of them because they know they'll stop. And that causes a major issue because then in a big city, I mean, it already happens like in big cities a little bit, right? Like, especially if let's say the crosswalk turns red and there's already like a line of people and it just keeps going. Like the chain is already started. Like, people will just be like, oh, I'm just going to keep going here. And kind of break the rules. But if everybody knows that they're self-driving cars, you can just walk out in front of them and they'll just slam on the brakes and then you can get across. So that's going to be a problem. I don't know how you solve that one.
But even when you have a passenger in there, like, hopefully social norms will kick in there and someone will be like, if I step in front of this car, there's a person in that car who's riding and is going to be pretty ticked off at me for doing that. He's probably going to scream out the window at me for doing that. So, there's social norms that I think at well.
Do me a favor, go to YouTube and type in road rage and then we'll talk tomorrow.
At least the person with the road rage doesn't have the wheel.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. All they can do is yell at each other and it's like, let me out of the car. Let me out of the car's like, it's like,
sorry,
no.
sir, you need to calm down first.
Yeah, your heart rate needs to get back to normal levels before I'll let you out. That's actually kind of interesting. I bet you anyway, we won't go down that tangent. We should move on. But to your point, Carl, I think that's the biggest takeaway is like, what is this going to mean? I mean, this is going to be like the thing that is referenced now in all of the arguments going forward.
Yep.
So, and honestly, like to me, that's a little depressing because I do think the tech it's going to make absolute sense at some point in the future, 8 years from now. And I would hate for that to be held back. Because it's a numbers game. So, okay. So our last news story was actually from Bill Gates commenting on Reddit. Somebody asked him, tabs or spaces.
Well, they just asked in general, not even him.
No, it was him. It was on his AMA. Yeah. I grabbed the screenshot. It was in his Ask Me Anything.
Okay.
So his response verbatim was, when I code, I use tabs because you want the columns to line up. For some Word documents, I use tabs. You want things to adjust when you go back and edit them, and tabs help. Yeah. So
there, it's settled.
How Dan is just like, I need to get out of my self-driving car and punch somebody.
for Word docs, that's fine. For Word, I thought if it was
that's
in a
the weird
coding
thing.
context, oh my goodness,
It is in a coding
Basically all the
context
way.
though. That's the thing. Like, I mean, it's Bill Gates, it's an AMA. Like, they were not asking about Word documents, and he knows that.
And one of the comments later on was, "Watch the meltdown at /programming."
Right. Exactly. I don't know though. Like, I don't know. I'm actually kind of mixed on this whole thing. Like, I've heard about like smart spaces, where it works like tabs. But I mean, how do you? Oh man, I'm just gonna move on. I'm not gonna dive into this because I'd rather talk about Blazor, honestly. So let's not get into tabs versus spaces. Okay. So to the reason that we actually have you guys on here. So like I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of hype and excitement around Blazor. So like, let's just start at like, what is it?
What is Blazor? Well, Blazor is bringing .NET to the web. You can have .NET code run natively in the browser with no plugins, no code transpilation, just using open web standards. Blazor is specifically it's a experimental web framework that we built using .NET that uses C#, Razor, HTML, CSS, and it runs in the browser via WebAssembly.
Mm-hmm. Magic.
So other than WebAssembly, what did it actually take to get this working? I mean, it sounds like even with WebAssembly, it's going to take a little bit of effort here.
It takes one very knowledgeable and capable dev who had a mission and had all the right knowledge and the right. I mean, you can't though dismiss the importance of the fact that the technology suddenly were available. Like the fact that WebAssembly is now here is what really enabled this to happen in a way that you could actually now use for production applications going forward. Like WebAssembly is just changing what the web means, and it's not just .NET. Like Rust has WebAssembly support. Go. There's projects in the Java world. Like makes all sense. These languages and platforms are taking advantage of this new format, WebAssembly, so they can get any code now running in the browser. But how did we get that all to come together? Well, that's all Steve. Steve, you can tell your story. He's the dad, the father of Blazor. So
okay, so back in about a year ago, when I had some conversations with some people about could we possibly do .NET in the browser with WebAssembly, and the general consensus was probably not, because there is no way of compiling .NET to WebAssembly. I went on a little sort of fishing expedition to see if I could find some way of doing it, however obscure. And I came across this little .NET runtime called .NET Anywhere. So it's not the regular .NET framework. It's not Core CLR, Core RT, or Mono, or any other recognizable .NET runtime, but it was rather this little open source project created by one guy called Chris Bacon, who wrote only about 100 C files or something, and it was enough to actually load and execute .NET assemblies on whatever platform you compile it to. Now, he did this about 6 years ago, so that's a long, long time before the advent of WebAssembly, and his target scenario was things like running .NET on embedded devices, or just running it on Linux, but without having to use Mono at that time, or just running it anywhere. Hence the name .NET Anywhere. Just C code, you compile it to any platform, you run your .NET assemblies. And because it was so portable, it was really easy, like literally probably less than an hour's work, to make a couple of tiny tweaks to it so that it compiled correctly through the WebAssembly compilation toolchain. And so that meant that I then had a WebAssembly file that could load and execute .NET assemblies. And that's really the core starting point. So it's really just a matter of, normal coding from there on to build up an entire web framework and have it work inside a browser. Yeah. So that's how we built the original prototype about a year ago. But since then, we have tried to make it much more production ready. And the biggest piece we needed for that was a proper .NET runtime. So as much as .NET Anywhere is a really impressive technical accomplishment for one person to have written in such a small amount of code, it was not really complete enough for somebody to go and build a production application on. There were a lot of things that it didn't do completely or correctly. For example, it didn't really have any proper reflection support, and obviously you're going to need that by the time you're building real applications. And there were lots of other edge cases that it didn't deal with correctly as well. So we got some very good news. When was it, Dan, that Mono told us that they were going to target WebAssembly?
I mean, it was not that long afterwards. Like they have their, they blogged it. Hello WebAssembly was the blog post on their thing. Yeah, that was in August of last year.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So the Mono team, in case any listeners are not aware, the Mono platform is Microsoft's standard supported .NET runtime for client scenarios. So that's the .NET runtime that you're using if you're doing iOS or Android programming through Xamarin. It's also the runtime that's used for Unity, which is like the biggest game engine by an enormous margin.
Because it was Xamarin who had Mono, and then we purchased Xamarin and got Mono. Is that right?
Yeah,
that's correct.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So it's part of the whole Microsoft family, corporation, whatever you want to call it. It is a corporation. So it's not, some people think, oh, it's using Mono, but when will it use real.NET? Well, they're wrong. Stop saying that, because Mono is real.NET.
I love that.
It's supported. It's the standard. Like it's not some sort of intermediate step or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's not some like unsupported thing. Like it's here now. It's rejoined the family. So
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, when the Mono team said they were going to target WebAssembly, that was great news for us, because that gave us a real direction to follow to have a proper supported production grade .NET runtime. And we were able to move over to that in about October with our initial prototype, and that was really easy to port what we had over to that. So now what we've got is a .NET runtime that supports .NET Standard 2, and it runs the considerable majority of NuGet packages that you can find out in the wild. The only things that it won't run are things that rely on APIs that don't make sense in a browser. So, for example, if you try to do file I/O,
or like serial port access, Windows registry access, whatever. It's all that stuff will throw a platform not supported, but everything else just going to work, and it does, and it keeps surprising me out by how much of it really just works when you throw something at it. Okay.
So in December or January, we got this go-ahead to start an experimental project where we would see if we could make a real thing out of this that people would actually want to use and would be production ready. So that's what we're doing at the moment. We're in the middle of this phase of trying to build this. It's not yet a committed product, but we are hoping that people are going to really like what we are doing, and then we're going to evaluate this after a little while and see whether or not this is going to be a real thing.
Okay, so I hate asking this next question, but I know that this is the question that everybody has to ask, which is, is this Silverlight all over again?
I think there's a few questions in that question.
Yeah.
So first of all, there are a lot of similarities between Blazor and Silverlight, so I think the question is fair.
Yeah.
Silverlight was fundamentally from a technology's perspective, a different model. It's a plugin. It had its own rendering stack. XAML based. We're not trying to do those things.
It was like circumventing standards. In hindsight, that's basically what it was doing, right? Like HTML's not cool. Like we'll extend it and do our own thing.
Yeah, and honestly, there were a lot of people that loved that model, and there's a lot of the same reasons that appealed. There are reasons why Blazor appeals. Like I'm a .NET developer. I know C#. I know how to use Visual Studio. I want to use those same skills to do client-side development for my web apps in the browser. And Blazor will give you that, but instead of requiring a plugin and a different UI stack, we're just going to use the open web standards. It's based on WebAssembly, HTML, CSS. We're really trying to target that broad set of web developers all up. So you're not going to get XAML with Blazor. That said, it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. There are actually
I was going to say, was it Frank Krieger is over there? Like he actually has it working. So,
and I think he's been talking with the Xamarin folks as well. It's actually the same runtime that we're using for Blazor. The mono WebAssembly based runtime he's using in the Wii project, and he's working on getting XAML working, which is great. And there's a set of developers that it appeals to. That's a different audience than really what we're trying to target with Blazor. Blazor. I think though another reason people ask about Silverlight though is how long is it going to live? Like is this really going to survive for the long term? And I wish I had a perfect crystal ball to predict that. I can tell you that my goal is to make Blazor, the best web development, full stack web development story that we can make, and have it be supported for a long, long, long time. That's about what we can say. That is the intent, and we are still in this experimental phase, in part because we want to make sure that we're going incrementally, in iterations, so that we make sure we've identified any potential blocking issues and that will hit us down the road in the long term, so that we don't start out with something, promise a product, and then later say, we said we were going to do that, but now we're not. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why we're starting a little bit slower, a little bit more conservative. But the goal is to have something that you can use for a good long time. Yeah,
because I think there were two key things in there. One of them being that it's writing to a standard. So, I mean, it's not a plugin. You're not modifying anything that you really shouldn't. There's nothing like super unnatural about it. It is just plugging into that standard WebAssembly. And then the other is, Silverlight, there was this whole issue. I mean, really, like the community, I should say the public at large, like, sort of abandoned it, which caused this effect, right? And in this case, like, that really can't happen because as a consumer, like, I don't even know what's going on. Like, I've browsed like the Blazor samples, and they just work. Like, I even view source, and like, it's even kind of hard to see that there's something that's not just regular JavaScript going on there. So I think it's totally different from that perspective.
It's also like we're being open source from the beginning. Yeah. Like the Blazor repo is on GitHub. It's in the ASP.NET org. You can see the code now. Like, that code is there. Silverlight, people wanted it to be open source for a while, but never really was made open source. So there's some longevity that you can get just because the source code is available. I think also because of the nature of WebAssembly, whether we do this or not, like, the ecosystem is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you can't really prevent it. Like, the standard is there, the technology is available. If for whatever business reason we decide to go a different direction at Microsoft, well, the tech, it's standardized. It's a thing that can be done, and other platforms will do it as well.
Don't wait for users to report problems. Raygun gives you complete visibility on errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. Replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files or having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window into how users are really experiencing your software applications, supports all major programming languages and platforms, and integrates with your current development workflow tools too. There's a free 14-day trial, and it takes minutes to implement, so start resolving issues in your application and check it out today at raygun.com.
WebAssembly, I just don't know the answer to this. Is it supported on mobile platforms?
Yes,
okay.
It is.
Okay, awesome.
So you were kind of leading into what I was kind of thinking already. What's stopping Google doing this with like Go or Rust or PHP or any of these other languages? Can they all do the same thing that what you have done with Blazor, or is there something that made this maybe a little bit more easier for you guys to accomplish?
Oh, they already are. Like, Rust already has WebAssembly as a compilation target. They are full in actually on this story. They've been blogging about it. I think the Go folks recently announced their support as well, that they're working on being able to take Go code and target it directly at WebAssembly. We're doing something a little bit different in that we're bringing actually the runtime into play. Like, we're at least right now, we're not taking all of your C# code and compiling all of the C# directly to WebAssembly. The only piece of WebAssembly code that's actually in play for a Blazor app right now is the mono runtime. Everything else is actually just normal .NET DLLs. That said, the mono folks do have an ahead of time compilation story that they are working on, where you can just take the whole app and compile it to WebAssembly, and that may have different performance characteristics and so forth that we'll want to take advantage of. Maybe that's something you do on the publish step, right? Like, you develop with just the .NET IL, and it's fast and iterative, and then you do a more lengthy compilation step to get everything to be WebAssembly once you go to publish to production. We don't know yet. Those are things that we're working through during this phase.
Okay. And then, like I said, I've looked at the samples, and one thing that I don't quite understand is, like, how does this interop with like JavaScript and the DOM, and because I have all these things sort of piled in there together. How do I talk between them? What can talk to what?
Okay. Well, WebAssembly itself has got mechanisms for making calls into JavaScript, and there are mechanisms for calling from JavaScript into WebAssembly, as you'd expect. So what we've done is we have put some nice .NET APIs around that on the .NET side. So if you want to call from your C# code into some JavaScript, there's a mechanism for saying that you want to make a call. It's just a static method that's part of the Blazor package, and you can pass whatever parameters you want to that. As long as they're JSON serializable, that's fine. And then on the JavaScript side, you declare a function with a matching name, and that's the function that the Blazor runtime is going to pass the execution onto. And then we'll deal with things like getting return values back and marshalling all the data across the wire. So that's pretty straightforward. Likewise, if you want to call .NET code from JavaScript, there's a set of Blazor APIs for that, which are themselves in JavaScript. So you can call those from null JavaScript code. Or basically, in summary, you can do it. And we have provided APIs for that. Does that answer your question? Or
that's part of it. Then the other thing was like interacting with the DOM. I mean, can I, in my .NET code, like interact with the DOM somehow?
Yeah, okay. So strictly speaking, the answer to that is yes, you can, because you can use the JavaScript interop APIs to do anything you want. So you could make a JavaScript API called setInnerHTML or something like that, which would take like a CSS selector and some HTML string, and then the implementation would just find that element and set the HTML on it, and then you could call that from your .NET code if you wanted to, and that would mean that you're just shoving stuff into the DOM straight from C#. So you can. However, part of our objective with Blazor is to provide a much nicer, higher level programming model. So you wouldn't want to do that. What we are doing in Blazor is allowing you to define components in Razor. So Razor being the same syntax that ASP.NET has used for many years as a way of combining HTML and C# code, and allowing you to define components in with files of that kind. And these components are similar to the sort of components that you would build with React or Vue or Angular. So they encapsulate a certain bit of your application. They've got their ability to render to HTML. They can deal with managing their own state. They can fetch data. You can combine them, nest them, compose them, whatever you want. And we deal with the rendering part of it for you. So you write your HTML in Razor and it gets into the UI. And as for how that actually happens, that's not your problem. That's our problem. And we make it very fast. We do all the necessary incremental rendering and diffing against previous versions and updating just the right parts of the DOM, all that stuff. So there's the minimum amount of overhead going on, but the developer doesn't have to care about that.
That's very cool. And then if you have a server application that's written in .NET and I am running .NET code in the browser and I start to make calls over there, like what does that look like? Because obviously I can just get back like the raw data, but is there a way to sort of, whenever I get that data back, have it, in the same type? Can I like share those types between the client and server? What does that look like?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
One of our project templates. We've got a couple of different project templates. One is a standalone, which is just a pure Blazor client app. But the other one is an example of, it's a good starting point if you want to host a Blazor application on an ASP.NET server. And in that project, it's it's a solution template. So when you create your solution, you have a server project, a client project, and a shared project. And the shared project is just a standard .NET class library. And the expectation is that you put your domain classes in there. So, the things that represent customers or sales or flights or whatever other business domain that you're operating in. And those same classes are available to both the server project and client project just via normal project references.
That's awesome.
So, you don't have to define things in more than one place. Okay. And serialization and deserialization is almost transparent.
That's cool. Well, so the serialization then, is it using JSON or is it like binary?
Yes.
Or okay, so it's just JSON over the wire. But like you said,
you could use other serialization formats if you wanted to, but I think almost every web developer is going to think JSON is the natural starting point.
Yeah, especially for just like, watching what's going on.
Yeah.
And then that sort of solves the problem of IntelliSense in the client then too, because since it's the same type, you get the full IntelliSense on those objects. So that's
sure
cool.
You do. Yeah, and you can share bits of logic as well. So if you've got things like properties that compute stuff from other fields, then it just works the same on the client as it does on the server.
Ooh, so that's really interesting for like validation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, because you just literally run the same validation code.
Yep.
So another scenario where you might want to use something other than JSON is like when you're using real-time framework like SignalR. Like one of the things we're working
I was
on is
thinking about
getting
SignalR.
we're getting the SignalR client, the .NET client, to work in a Blazor application. So you can have a real-time connection to the back end and have all the strong typing of the SignalR client working within the browser. And under the covers, that's not using JSON typically. Like I think in the ASP.NET Core implementation, they're taking advantage of things like message pack and binary formats and those types of things. Yep. But at the end of the day, all you see is strongly typed C# objects with lovely IntelliSense.
Awesome, love it.
Yeah, I know this is still in an experimental mode right now, but you had talked about the different ways to create these new project types. But is there any story right now if I want to start playing with integrating this into an existing application that I have?
Well, depends what you want to do, really. So if you imagine you've got some existing solution.
I'm converting everything right now.
Let's imagine you've got some existing solution that's got an ASP.NET Core backend that serves up JSON over various API endpoints. You can just go like add new project into that solution, choose Blazor standalone client app, and then add a reference to that from your server project, and your server project can just start serving that client application. So you can certainly add an entirely new UI with Blazor into your application. If you wanted to do something where you somehow merged a Blazor UI with an existing server-generated HTML UI with ASP.NET MVC or Razor Pages or something, you would be a little bit more on your own with that right now. That's not a scenario that we've focused on. I don't think that's going to be ultimately as popular a scenario. I'm sure there's some way of doing it, but really we focus more on create a pure Blazor application right now.
Okay. And then you mentioned, you were talking about the binding earlier and how it uses Razor. So how do you, what does that actually look like? I mean, is it literally just the same binding syntax then? I mean, you have you sort of have your client side controller almost, and it just gets bound to the view.
I would refrain.
I should say client side model. I guess I would say. Sorry, not
components. We have you have components in the
that's right. You're talking about the components. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Also, I wouldn't. Let's back away from the word binding for a minute because that means a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
So the simplest way of creating a Blazor component is literally as a Razor CS HTML file. And the simplest Blazor component is literally an empty file, and it does nothing. But anything that you type into there is markup that it's going to render. And then if you create an @functions block, you can put some C# code in there. Mm-hmm. And then inside the HTML, you can use the @ symbol and start referencing stuff from your C# code. So you can just sort of build it up syntactically like that. And so, yes, to answer your question, it is literally standard Razor. Awesome. That said, there are some Razor features that are not applicable on the client, or where we've chosen to do things slightly differently. Or, in fact, there's even more cases where we've added new concepts that wouldn't have existed before. So, for example, we've just integrated in the last couple of days routing, as I say, or routing, as most of your listeners say it, into these Blazor components. So at the top of it, you can say @page, and then you write out a URL, and that becomes the URL that particular component can be reached upon. Now, that's a new way of doing routing. It's not how it works in MVC or in Razor Web Pages. Mm-hmm. But it's a really natural fit in Blazor. So we are willing to do things a little bit differently, but we're trying to strike a balance between keeping it familiar and yet not sort of doing stuff in an unnatural way just for the sake of consistency.
If it helps, when you think about defining a Blazor component, you're really just defining a class. A Blazor component is just a class that implements a particular iComponent interface under the covers. But that's kind of hidden to you. For the most part, what you're worrying about is, well, I have some markup that I want this class to be able to spit out. To render into the virtual DOM, and that's what you're defining in the HTML tags in your CS/HTML file. But then this is just a normal class as well, so we can have properties and methods, and you can define those inline in the CS/HTML file, or you can define them in a code behind file. And then in your Razor syntax, you can use the normal syntax, a little at symbol, and then you start writing C#. And IntelliSense there will then show you like what are all the properties on this component class, what are the methods on this component class. So you can do things like you can have a button and you can say on click, but when you click this button, I want you to call this C# method that I've defined on this same class. And one of the really nice things about Blazor and C# is we can really enable just a fantastic editor experience, like give you all these completions and tooling in IntelliSense over the structure of that class, because it's just a normal C# class. Similarly, if you had like an input that's just a text box and you want to bind the value of that text box to some property on the component so that you can use it in code, you can say bind and then specify the property name, and that will then bind the value of the input to that particular property. And those are all things that, again, have IntelliSense and tooling around them. So that's how that part of the system works.
That is super cool. So, I was talking about before having like client and server validation, but what if you take that one step further? I mean, can you literally have an application that runs client side or server side? I mean, I haven't really thought through the question, but like, is that a thing? Like, because one of the issues with a lot of these frameworks like Angular is that, they're 100% client side. And I think some of the search engines, I know there's some workarounds to like make these things work, but can I literally, like, if somebody comes to my site, maybe they have like JavaScript disabled, I don't know, and then it goes server side. I guess it's different because then there's no binding. So I guess I'm sort of answering myself, but I don't know. You have a better answer to that?
Well, I think that starts. There's a feature that I think Angular and React frameworks do have as well. It's where you do basically pre-render on the server, where you basically run the Angular app on the server to generate the HTML structure that you send down to the client really, really fast. Or maybe that's the only thing they see because they can't run JavaScript if that were the case. As a way to optimize the site, and we do plan to do. The same feature in Blazor apps as well, the ability to pre-render.
Cool.
That's it. I mean, pre-rendering, it's kind of a specialized scenario. It's a very particular optimization. It may not be for everyone, but it is something we do plan to support. And as much as possible, we want the programming model that we enable for Blazor to be consistent with things that you use and that when doing server-side development with like ASP.NET Core. That's one of the reasons why we're using Razor and CSHTML and these type of syntaxes that people have some familiarity with.
All right, I'm looking at the Blazor project on GitHub right now, and I can see that the latest commit was just 9 hours ago by Steve himself. So obviously, this is pretty active. Is there, and out in the public, is there anything on the roadmap that you guys would like to talk about?
Well, we are coming up here really soon and having our first preview release of Blazor, the 0.1 release. This will be our first alpha. Some bits for people to try out. And you'll be able to download and install a V6 into Visual Studio, file new project, your first Blazor app, and away you go. And we can't wait to hear what people's feedback is on that. You also can do it from the command line. Like if you're on a Mac or you just prefer operating with Visual Studio Code and the command line, we have .NET CLI templates like .NET New Blazor. You can do that from the command line and get exactly the same templates. That will work as well. So yeah, we're pretty excited, pretty pumped about this first release. It is the first release, so there's a lot more to come. There's more features that we plan to add, but there's quite a bit there already. You can do quite a lot, and we've already seen some really neat things that people have done with even the nightly builds of Blazor. If you really want to get cutting edge, you're welcome to also just grab our nightly builds of the V6 and try those out. Mileage may vary at any given moment. But the first official preview is coming out any minute now.
Okay. That's really cool because I do a lot of Node stuff and recently I've done a lot of client work and I've done Angular and I've done a little bit of Vue.js. And of course, there's like a flavor of the month with those types of things. And I try to keep up as best as I can. And I need to do some server side stuff. So I used Express, and then I had to bring in a templating engine, and they present you with, it has to be at least 30 options. It's just really tough to figure out which templating engine am I supposed to use. So I picked one and I used it, but it worked totally different than all the client side libraries. So it feels like, I guess I'd have to look at this a little bit more, but it really feels to me like there's a lot more parity because in .NET, while you still have like as much choice as you want, there are generally like particular technologies that a lot of people rally around. I mean, there's obviously the code itself, which is what I mean, it's the same everywhere. The capabilities obviously change a little bit. But then there's, like you said, I mean, you're using Razor and you're just building components out of Razor. And I think that's pretty exciting because it's something that I think a lot of people are going to rally around, and just the number of technologies that I have to learn is a lot shorter. And I feel like finding answers and things like that is going to be a lot easier.
Yeah, I think we hope to do a number of things by introducing .NET for client-side development.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is just make it easier to get started. Like when you want to create a Blazor app, file a new project, run it, you're set to go. Like the build system is set up, the project is set up, it runs. That we want to make it super easy to get going. We want to give you a platform that feels stable and consistent. Like it's not going to change dramatically under your feet while you're trying to develop. I mean, we have .NET Standard, we have MS Build for our build engine. Those things are mature. They've been around for a long time. They're feature rich, and they're not going anywhere. They're not just going to break underneath you. And then at the same time, you get to take advantage of things like the tooling and the languages and using .NET on the back end. If you're using .NET Core on the back end, our perf numbers right now are looking pretty spectacular. In 2.1, they're just going to knock people's socks off. So you get a fast, scalable, secure back end to go with it. And we hope that will appeal to a fair number of web devs.
I think it will. This is awesome. I mean, it's just such a cool environment. Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we missed?
Just when the bits go out, just keep in mind it is experimental. So don't go try and use this for your next production app.
I'm going to ship it.
Yet.
Ship it.
Yeah.
Don't listen to Dan. It's ready to go.
But please try it out and let us know what you think. Like try out the component model. Like we want to build up a great ecosystem of shareable components that are just NuGet packages that you can add. Experiment with the JavaScript interop. We had folks, you mentioned the MVP Summit. We had folks there, building NuGet packages that gave you access to like local storage, access to the the ambient light sensor. One guy had like a little light meter that he built in Blazor and C# using just the browser APIs. That was cool stuff. So try out that stuff. Let us know what you think and how we can make it better. File issues on GitHub. If you want to talk with us, also we hang out on Gitter, the Blazor Gitter, and we'd love to chit chat on scenarios that maybe you're thinking about or things that you'd like to see Blazor do. We're happy to hear all that stuff. That is the point of this phase, is so we can hear that kind of feedback.
Very cool stuff. Okay, so let's move on to the Azure pick of the week, which is actually there's kind of two pieces of this. But basically, in preview right now is low priority VMs on scale sets. But the other half of this is just the fact that there are low priority VMs. So if you get a low priority VM, a lot of the SKUs have this available where you can basically get a VM that can be preempted. So basically you're using the VM and then you can't use it anymore. But if you are able to deal with that, if you have an application that's pretty fault tolerant, let's say it's doing like batch stuff or whatever, and I know this is integrated with Azure Batch as well, you can use those VMs and there's significant savings. I don't think I have the pricing calculator up anymore, but I think it was almost like a tenth of the cost. So you can get VMs ridiculously cheap. So if you need to do, like I said, like batch processing, they're really great for that. But they're now integrated. There's an option to integrate those with scale sets as well. There's a flag for that. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes. So I encourage everybody to check that out. And Carl, what do you have for the dev tip of the week?
So last year at Build 2017, Microsoft announced adaptive cards, and this is a JSON schema format that allows you to, just describe some content that you want that will always look native on whatever platform it's being rendered on. So you essentially describe it and it just looks native. So on iOS, it looks like iOS. On Android, it looks like that. But my pick of the week this week is a React renderer for adaptive cards. And one of the reasons why I picked this is last month in February, adaptive cards officially hit the 1.0 milestone. And already there is a pretty solid looking React renderer for this. So I'm pretty excited to see where this technology goes.
Very cool. Very cool. And I was gonna say I don't even know where the game is, so I can't even take it out. So I apologize, to everybody.
You switched offices. Anybody watching the video?
They just keep moving us, and they're gonna like bulldoze this building anyway. So that's why you see I have like nothing in here. So we'll have to skip the fun game that we play. But Dan, where can people find you online?
So if you want to reach me on Twitter, I'm at DanRoth27. I'm the 27th Dan Roth.
Perfect. And Steve, where can people find you?
On Twitter, I am Steven Sanderson. That's Steven with an N. Okay. Don't tweet at the Steve Sanderson because that is a different software developer.
Oh, he's also a developer.
It is, yeah.
Pretty cool. Okay, so Carl, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Carl Schweitzer.
And you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/ytechie. So Dan and Steve, thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us about this. This is such a cool technology that I can't wait to try out.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.